Okay, hi everyone. Hopefully, if you're joining us for the workshop, the ICS workshop in April 2022, hopefully you've already said hello to us. But this first pre-recorded video, we are going to be talking a bit about what epigraphy is, its history as a discipline, and some of the background things you might need to know before we get into the skills that we would need as epigraphists. So this video is going to be filmed as a discussion between me and Gabriel Bodard and Irene Vagionakis. And Gabby is going to start us off with some background on the history of epigraphy, and particularly Greco-Roman epigraphy is what we're focusing on here.
Great. Thanks, Katherine. Yeah, so I really just wanted to say a few words about what we mean by epigraphy and what that has meant over the last couple of thousand years, and what that means in terms of epigraphy as a discipline. Basically, I think it's probably been the case that as long as people have been writing in any culture, people have written some kinds of texts on monumental objects, so on stone or other durable materials, metal, clay that's then baked, etc., that has been meant to last and probably has been meant to be seen. Okay, so we have funerary inscriptions, we have contracts, decrees, religious or political honorifics, building dedications, all kinds of things that are very, very public. There have also been slightly less public things like letters, curses, graffiti, private dedications, which are sort of on the border between epigraphy and other disciplines. If the more durable they are, the more likely they are to be considered epigraphy. And there are some things which, like, curse tablets, for example, which are often written on lead or other metals, are of interest to epigraphers because of their material and their content, but are also of interest to papyrologists because of their similarity to handwritten texts written on things like paper and papyrus and so forth. So there's there's not a clear boundary between them, and there's things that both disciplines are perfectly happy to look at, and there's also things like coins, seal impressions, which again have certain things in common with either epigraphy or papyrology, but are normally studied by different disciplines. There's also the slight peculiarity that the more that something, however epigraphic it might look, if it's from Egypt, is also going to be read by papyrologists, just because that's where most of the papyri are. But so it's not a very clear-cut distinction, but generally we're talking about either monumental text or texts on durable materials tend to be the things that epigraphers look at. And so in the Greco-Roman world, we know that inscriptions go back as far as recorded history does, at least. We know that, for example, in Herodotus, one of the earliest historical writers, he sometimes quotes inscriptions as evidence for things that happened in a previous generation, right? So he's already reading inscriptions as evidence for history, or even contemporary history in his case. Okay, and we know, for example, there are examples of inscriptions turn up in plays. In particular, Aristophanes invents inscriptions for some of his fictional places and countries, and they get mentioned in other contexts. So they were clearly, people were aware that reading inscriptions meant something and could tell you something about the people who put them up and why. And so inscriptions have been read as evidence for history or for other things from the past ever since, basically since antiquity. In the late antique period, people and the Byzantine period, people collected poems that were written on inscriptions, sometimes on funerary inscriptions or other kinds of poems. There's an entire book of the Greek anthology which is collected from inscriptions that people had written poems on, and so forth. And in the medieval period, not only in the Greek East, but also in the rest of the European world, the world formerly influenced by Rome, as it were, their ancient inscriptions and not so ancient inscriptions were sometimes used as support for land claims, or for family history and so forth. And that in some cases those were completely spurious, but the point of that is that people saw inscriptions as evidence for history, and that they could use it for contemporary value. There were other uses of inscriptions. Inscriptions were sometimes seen as decorative. Inscriptions were sometimes seen as having weird ritual power. There were inscriptions that were written in no longer understood languages. So, for example, Punic inscriptions in Spain. There's evidence that at least occasionally those inscriptions were considered to be magical in some way, and so they could be used sort of apotropaic way, even if it was a completely banal inscription about a decree or something in its original use, and when no longer understood, it's given a certain sort of gravitas by being ancient and by being on stone. Later, then, in the late medieval, early modern, and modern period, inscriptions were of interest to people who were starting to have an interest in antiquity. In particular, you start seeing the Grand Tour going around the Greek and Roman worlds, and people collected inscriptions, among other things. I mean, they're not the most popular thing to collect because they tend not to be as attractive as statues and monumental architecture and so forth. But people did collect inscriptions, and as a result, as things started to have value, people started to fake inscriptions, and so there's all sorts of forged inscriptions that were created in the early modern period that were sold, or possibly other reasons. That there's again, if you're at the workshop, you'll hear later in the week a bit more about forged inscriptions there. And then modern historians, especially from the 18th century onwards, have studied inscriptions as part of the evidence for history, as the primary evidence for historical events and historical persons. Katherine is going to talk a bit more about that in a minute, especially as this became codified in historical practice from the 19th century. But one thing I sort of wanted to think about as that's helped to develop epigraphy as a discipline was the beginnings of the discipline of papyrology, which really only became a separate discipline in its own right from about the 1880s, with the discovery of this huge cache of papyri from Oxyrhynchus, and the sheer volume and historical value and philological and literary innovation, and the scale of publication that arose from that, and the massive amount of funding that was available because of the excitement about these things, really led to a real codification of the discipline, and that's what led ultimately to the Leiden system that we're going to talk about in another session, that arose from papyrological practice primarily, and is central to epigraphic practice. So that's sort of what we mean by epigraphy and how it got to let's say the 19th century, where Katherine's going to take over and talk a bit more about the history of the modern discipline.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Gabby. So I'll put these pictures up because I like pictures. Is that visible? Yeah. Cool. So kind of going back to that this kind of overlap time that Gabby's already mentioned, when we get in the late 18th and early 19th century, is a kind of crossover point between what you might call antiquarianism. You kind of come across that term, and the sort of discovering and collecting of inscriptions, and sometimes the transcribing of inscriptions, and that interest kind of morphs into what we would recognize as the modern discipline of epigraphy. And as Gabby's already said, later in the 19th century, that's partly driven by excitement around papyrology as well. But we have this interesting kind of crossover point in the early 1800s where we have things, really famous things like the Rosetta Stone, which has a lot of excitement around it, that is found and, is transcribed, found in 1799. I think it's transcribed more or less by 1801, 1802, but not fully really understood until the 1820s. But during that time, people are thinking about it and working on it, right? So there is this point at which collecting and interest becomes academic study and kind of morphs into this modern discipline. And one of the people who was really instrumental in that, from kind of mainly from the 1840s onwards, is Theodore Monson, who is hugely famous in the discipline for really founding it as a modern discipline in its own right. Momson's kind of known as an ancient historian by a lot of people. He won a Nobel Prize for his work on Roman history, but I think in our discipline we know him as an epigrapher. And he founded, it was the kind of a leading light in the foundation of the CIL. So that is the main, corpus of Latin inscriptions that is still used by many of us to this day in its various forms. And there's lots of, photos and paintings of him looking very serious and scholarly. But the CIL was kind of founded in the 1840s, and it was the first elements of it were published in the 1860s. But it's still being updated more or less, right? There's and we'll talk about how these kind of corpora have morphed into digital projects as well. And now apparently it has around 200,000 Latin inscriptions. So, but I think I just wanted to when I talk about the CIL, I always want to kind of highlight how they've organized it, because I think that's had such a huge impact on how the whole discipline of epigraphy is organized. So not only is it saying these are Latin inscriptions, right? So we're going to collect all the Latin inscriptions, but it's done mainly geographically. So the volumes are mainly from geographical areas, some quite small geographical areas and some larger ones where there's fewer inscriptions. But there's also some volumes that are by type of inscription. So if you look right down to the bottom, volume 15, Instrumenta Domestica, as a separate thing. So that means, inscriptions on small, objects, loom weights, things like this. And that has basically been separated out since the 19th century as a different type of thing. And that's still really influential even now, that might be separated out from the monumental things on stone, on bronze, that are kind of meant to be seen. This geographic approach, obviously, really, really influential as well. But also, volume 1 is stuff older than from before the death of Julius Caesar. And that's another really influential thing, that the early stuff kind of gets put in a different box. But, we'll come back to kind of some of the implications of this. But this is, the CIL and, Mommsen as a cataloger, and not just a cataloger, but a person who really set up how you go about, methodologically, how you go about finding and recording inscriptions in a consistent way over a huge number of texts, is obviously a huge founder of the discipline. On the Greek side, things are a bit more complicated, because I didn't know quite as much about this, in fact, but actually we have an interesting split, because there's the CIG, which is kind of less used, because it's sort of, it is still used, but it sort of fizzled out a little bit, and the Inscriptiones Graecae kind of took over and was really the thing that was supposed to be a parallel to Mommsen's CIL. And I think this is something that has a really interesting kind of difference between the two founders. Is you kind of look at the guy August Bock, who founded the CIG, and he's very much in that more antiquarian mold, and he kind of falls that side of the divide maybe, whereas Adolf Kirchhoff was a linguist of Greek. He was a famous linguist, so he had that kind of more Mommsen style scholarly thing. So this divide in the 19th century, basically, when things go from just interesting and being recorded to being studied in this much more systematic way, where things are laid out very, in a very systematic way. I feel it was really interesting when Gabby mentioned about funding coming from interest, because Inscriptiones Graecae also had a bit of a hiatus in the mid 20th century or late 20th century because of lack of interest, right? And interest in these things has come back, and funding has come back as of the late 20th century and early 21st century. And suddenly actually projects are, getting a lot more interest, because people are interested in digitizing, in making things more accessible, and so on. So it's interesting to think of ourselves as part of a kind of upswing from a little bit of a maybe low point in the late 20th century. So there has been, a slightly more complicated history with Greek, definitely. Another set of people who are really credited with kind of founding epigraphy as a discipline is Jean and Louis Robert, who published a lot of bulletins épigraphiques from the 30s to the 80s, from the whole mid 20th century. And this is not just a bulletin of inscriptions that had been found and published, but also a bulletin of the analysis of inscriptions and articles about inscriptions and epigraphic topics. And I think this is what makes epigraphy become really a field in its own right. I think even though the methodology of CIL is so important, I guess sometimes in the early 20th century, epigraphy is thought of as a kind of adjunct to ancient history. Like, you want to do inscriptions so that you understand ancient history better. I think when we get into the mid 20th century, it kind of crystallizes as a separate field a lot more. I don't know if the other two would agree with this, but that, and Jean and Louis Robert obviously are a really big part of that, and also published a lot of Greek inscriptions as well. Just to kind of highlight the importance of this bibliographical approach, obviously something that's really well used by a lot of us who work on Greek epigraphy or similar topics is the SEG, which again has gone through these phases where things have slightly fallen by the wayside, although I think one of those is basically the Second World War. This is trying to collect everything that has been published on Greek epigraphy. So not just cataloguing, and gathering inscriptions together, but gathering together all the analysis and all the wider work that's happening on Greek epigraphy. And of course, the big innovation in the last few years being that becomes a digital searchable tool as well, and not just physical books, although I think they still make the physical books now. So that kind of approach where we show that it's not just the inscriptions themselves as text that are important, but it's having a bibliography where you can read about all the different approaches to the inscriptions as well. And that's something obviously that's really well used even today from the early 20th century, that has kind of kept pace with our modern way of working and going online and so on. But I just want to highlight as well, just moving to a slightly different topic, language and script. So this is something that I know a lot of us are getting more interested in. There's a lot of different traditions of epigraphic scholarship that developed in parallel in the 18th and 19th century. We're only really talking about the Greco-Roman ones. There's lots of other ones. But the conventions that are used for Latin and Greek are not the same ones that are used for lots of other things that are present in the Mediterranean as well. So Coptic, hieroglyphic Egyptian scripts that are cuneiform scripts, Linear B, and so on. And I've just put an example from Linear B. Linear B has ideograms, and so the transcription of this is normally ois F, which means female sheep, but it's in Latin. Part of the transcription system is Latin, even though it is a script used to write Greek. So all different languages and scripts have their own kind of transcription system. And a lot of this is based on the fact that in the days of print resources, you could only really print things in Latin, characters, or in Greek characters. You couldn't print things in other characters very much. So a lot of these other languages and scripts of the Mediterranean have come up with all these very creative ways of transcribing and representing themselves. And one problem or opportunity for us to think about is whether that's still how we want to do things, right? Transcribing them in this way. And I said I was going to just say, I think about the CIL and its organization being so influential. And I think that partly that's because it said, we are looking at Latin. We are going to divide up the world by language. Now, you don't have to do it that way, of course. And there's a really interesting room in the Museo Campano in Capua that I visited a few years ago, called the Monson Lapidary. And in this room, they have all the things from their museum that Monson kind of catalogued for them in the 1870s. when he was traveling through Italy, gathering all the information for CIL. Now, these are not all in Latin. Some of them are in Greek, some of them are in Oscan, they're in different alphabets. So not all of them are in CIL, the Latin ones are. But, you know, and Monson could have said, all right, well, I'm going to, you know, write a book about all the inscriptions from, you know, Campania, or all the inscriptions from Capua. But what he did, you know, he gathered them for their museum, but the CIL really is only on the Latin side. It does occasionally include things in other languages when it might be Latin, or when it appears next to a Latin inscription or something like that. But basically, you know, that approach of saying I'm going to focus on Latin has really made a difference to how our whole field operates. Whereas if you did it site by site, it would look very different. This is an Oscan example from that room. Now, the kind of tradition that we've come up with is to transcribe this into Latin characters and into bold. There's all sorts of things this doesn't capture. It doesn't capture the script. It doesn't capture the direction of the script, which is right to left, if you can kind of see that. Oh, sorry, I've transcribed that wrong. It should be park and then brackets is. I apologize for the poor transcription. But the you know, but in these days when we can use all different fonts if we want, all different typefaces, could we do something quite different? And actually, should we be transcribing things in a different way? Or is that actually not helpful, because then we lose the connection with the past scholarship? So language and script is a really, I think, interesting problem for digital epigraphy and how we carry on from the tradition of epigraphy that already exists. My interest is in things like Oscan. Others of you will have other interests in other languages and other scripts. Obviously, we've talked about the CIL cataloging by, you know, by language and then by place primarily, or sometimes by type. You can go a different way, and I just wanted to mention, you know, a recent project is the Inscriptions of Sicily project, which just goes, we're going to do all the inscriptions in all the languages on Sicily, but only on stone, in fact, because you have to limit it somehow, right? Going in a completely different direction. If Monson had started in that direction, how different would the field look now? Would we not be dividing ourselves up by, you know, Latinists and Hellenists in the same way at all? Perhaps not. And, you know, just another example that came to mind, and I know very little about this, I'm just aware that they exist, but, you know, if you wanted to do something because you wanted to group some texts together because although they're in different languages and different scripts, and there's slightly different types of text, but they have something in common. So these are the Edicts of Ashoka that are in, you know, appear in many different languages and scripts across India and Pakistan and nearby areas. But, you know, could you start a field of epigraphy by doing it that way, organizing things by sort of, you know, the commissioner of the texts, almost this group of texts that belong together. So yeah. Just to kind of highlight that how the modern discipline started out and how it was founded has really had a big influence on us today. And it leaves us with things that are, like I say, potential problems, potential opportunities as well.
Yeah, thanks, Katherine. One thing that occurs to me coming out of that is that the same sort of distinction between the different kinds of collections still occurs in a lot of digital digital epigraphic corpora, and in particular, there are two quite different approaches to digital publication of epigraphy, which have yet to be reconciled properly. One is the sort of CIL type approach. Let's get every single inscription in Latin or in Greek or from the ancient world or whatever your connection is, and put them all in one place so that people can search them. And the original premise of these was that these would not therefore be new publications. This would be a tool for people to get them access to the print publication, so they would find the traditional publication by finding the resource in this large corpus. Now, a lot of these large corpora now do also improve the readings. They try and get as much, you know, autopsy and research going on in the construction of the database, but it's still largely a massive collection where one of the most important things you can get out of this resource is having searched for it and found the bibliographical reference. which, as an aside, a lot of people, a lot of users, and I'm not talking about lazy, cheating students here. I'm talking about, you know, senior professors who are very, very serious about themselves and their discipline, will find an inscription through one of these big, massive digital databases and will cite the print publication, possibly without looking at the print publication, even if they trust the database enough. And that's just something to sort of think about. How many, you know, levels of academic good practice are being broken there. The other category of digital publication that we see are a small corpora, usually small. I mean, we could be talking about up to a few thousand texts, where every inscription published in there is a new edition. So just as if you were producing a print publication of a corpus of 600 inscriptions from a particular site within a particular date range, and, you know, narrowed down by language and material and all the other things that would, you know, that you do to make it a manageable sized resource. This is exactly the same process. It's just they're published digitally with all the additional benefits of doing so, of searchability, of multiple views possible, and all that sort of stuff, which we'll talk about elsewhere and in other videos. But and it's not yet clear quite how to reconcile these two different types of corpus. I mean, ideally, we take all of these small corpora, which have produced new editions of, you know, hundreds or thousands, and now between them tens of thousands, surely, of inscriptions, and we make them all searchable from a single place, right? Because they should all be able to be collected into one place so that we can use them as one of these massive databases, and they will be the latest and the best readings in all cases. And ideally, we'll have rich searchable apparatus criticus as well, so we can see the readings that have changed over time. So in case we don't like a particular reading, the other readings are available as well. But that's not yet quite there. Even though the vast majority of these corpora are using Epidoc, it's not yet the case that anyone has figured out how to put them all in one place and search them all across in a single platform. And the other approach that people have taken is that you know, there is, because a lot of these things are in Epidoc or in other digital standards, to be able to move these, migrate and copy and then transform the texts from these individual corpora into these bigger databases. So the bigger databases are fed by these smaller but richer ones. And that, again, that requires you know, somebody to do the work in each case, and somebody in each database to be interested in putting their material into the big database, and the big database has to be interested in getting their material from the small database. And that you know, that requires this sort of coincidence of two people being interested at the same time and knowing about each other. So that sort of distinction between the different kind of project, I think, is still an interesting one.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Irene, you've worked on a big sort of epigraphic project. How do you find these kind of challenges playing out in your day-to-day work?
Well, just to add a note of what Gabby just said, something that will simplify any future approach is the fact that now that most of digital projects are using or are planning to use Epidoc, or at least a shared standard, to say that in this way, any future operation will be simplified. So either if we want to go towards the creation of a central place where to be able to search all the digitized inscriptions, or to transform them into a greater corpus in the way that you say, that this will much easier. Of course, this is not happening in an automatic way. It requires the intervention of people that actively do something for that. You say something about my experience with inscriptions. Well, I can just say that we live in the best period ever for working with epigraphy, because a lot has been done in the last 20 years, and it's really a pleasure to work with all that period of history, starting from Monson and forward, and with all the Epidoc work that has been done lately. So I can't add much more on this. What would you like to share about your experience with epigraphy?
Well, I think I agree with you. It's a great time to be working on it. I would also say, although we have these great tools like Epidoc and so on, kind of coming back to the language and script thing, I think we have all these little decisions to make all the time, and everyone solves the problem slightly differently. So it's very hard, even when we have a shared language, to get an absolutely shared standard across everyone. So that's an ongoing challenge, I think.
Something that probably is a limit towards the creation of a corpora that gather inscriptions in different languages, as you mentioned before, is probably the fact that each discipline or subdiscipline has slightly different conventions, as we are going to see in the Leiden Convention session. And this is an obstacle in a certain way to put different things together, because what do? We uniform the conventions, adopting the Latin one or the Greek one or other ones, or we keep together inscriptions that are encoded slightly differently. So with the same phenomena that are marked differently, with no real reason except the fact that things are like this because of history, because of what we have been doing for a long time. So this is something that could be improved, yes.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think further, the difficulty is not a technical one. There is not a technical difficulty with resolving these issues so much as there is a disciplinary and diplomatic issue, and it's the same issue with getting stuff into databases. The difficulty is not that it's hard to get stuff from one database to another. They're both digital, they're both unambiguous, they both separate their data in a well-documented way. We can transform between one and the other, especially in the last few years when there's tools for doing that in Epidoc, and both databases are aware of Epidoc, even if it's not their primary data set. The technical problem is solved. I'll overstate it slightly. I'll just say it's solved. The real problem is that people have to want to do it. And some people are a little bit more protective of their data. Some people are a little bit more concerned about peer review and who did the work and how good was the work. Some people like to have a massively collaborative project where they have lots of students working on inputting stuff, and that makes someone else then suspicious of the quality of that thing. Unfairly, I think, but it does. So there's all sorts of reasons which, even if we had solved all the technical problems, as I'm claiming we sort of have, it's not going to happen overnight. There's all sorts of issues in the way, and I think you're absolutely right that among them are these issues of that people are much more protective of their transcription styles. We can't do that because you use underdots in the wrong way. That's solvable, but because Epidoc doesn't use underdots. Sorry, just Epidoc uses a semantic tag to say what the issue is. So if you want to represent that as underdots and someone else wants to represent that by making the text green, that's trivial. That's solved.
Great. Well, I think we've been talking for about half an hour, so we should probably leave it there for the journey through epigraphy up to the very current problems of present day. But thanks very much, guys.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.